Hello, everyone. Welcome. Can you all hear me well? If someone can just type in the chat if can see my screen and also hear me well, that would be great. And we're just giving a couple of more minutes for everyone to join. Thanks, Rebecca. I can see more people joining. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so I think we can get started. So it's 4:02 in Amsterdam, 3:02 in London, where our panelists are at the moment. Before we get started with our webinar, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Lara, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Green Story. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks everyone for joining our Green Story webinar series. This one is about greenwashing in fashion and the do's and don'ts for brands. First of all, just a few words about Green Story. Green Story is a sustainability platform that enables brands to accurately measure and communicate the positive impact of their products and also make them carbon neutral by combining life cycle assessment methodology with interactive data and impact visuals and a carbon offset platform. We reach the customer experience with the brand's Green Story throughout the customer life cycle. We partnered with hundreds of sustainable fashion players like Pangaea, Thread, Hanes Brands, and Pact, and Bamboo Clothing. And we work with a global team with a vision to empower 1 billion people to know their impact and make choices that are better for the planet and the generations to come. In this webinar, 1 second, let me just put this back. This webinar, we'll find out more what the Green Claims Code by the UK CMA entitles and why it was released with Mike Coates, who's Assistant Director, Consumer Protection at the CMA, and also we'll learn together the do's and don'ts from brands when communicating sustainability with Geraint Lloyd-Taylor, partner at Lewis Silkin. So without any further ado, if the panelists would like to introduce themselves, Mike, would you like to spend a couple of minutes talking about your work and your role at the CMA?
Yes, sure. My name is Mike Coates. I'm Assistant Director at the Competition and Markets Authority. For the last year, I've been working on this project, looking into misleading environmental claims. I've also got responsibility within the organisation for our relationships with other enforcers across the UK, so it's quite useful in this context because obviously we share responsibilities with a number of other authorities, enforcement authorities in the UK. So that looks quite nicely, and I'm also the representative for the CMA on the International Consumer Protection and Enforcement Network, where we're also linking up with other enforcement agencies around the world who are similarly interested in these sort of subjects. So all of that converges quite nicely in this project. So welcome everyone, looking forward to discussing this.
And hi everyone, I'm Geraint. I'm a partner and deputy head of advertising marketing law at Lewis Silkin, which is a law firm based in the UK. We're ranked #1 for advertising and marketing advice, and we're going to be covering more than advertising and marketing today, obviously, but I thought I'd mention my particular expertise. I've been doing that for over 15 years, and I advise some of the world's biggest and best known brands and social media platforms, influencers, ad agencies, trade bodies, etc., etc. So I have a lot of different perspectives on these different issues. I advise across all sorts of different sectors as well, and all sorts of different topics, including obviously environmental claims increasingly. And I deal routinely with investigations through advertisers like the ASA and the CMA, particularly in defending against those sorts of investigations, and bringing them to a sort of sensible conclusion. But I've called a truce with Mike today for these purposes, so it won't get awkward with anyone. So yes, that's a bit about me. And I'm sure we can chat more as the hour progresses.
Fantastic. Thank you both. I'm just in some of the comments. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear well at the stage. And I apologize if there was a bit of a technical problem while I was speaking. So just confirming that everyone can hear well.
I think it's fine. I think there's a little bit of jerkiness with your sound, Lara, but otherwise I think we're good.
I'm sorry about that. Still choppy. Okay, all good. Okay, let's go ahead. For the audience, please also, there's a question tab on your right-hand side. So please just post your questions. Just post your questions in there. And I would like to start with the first question. I think I want to start with Mike. We're here to talk about the Green Claims Code. So we had a conversation last week, and I'm sure that you had plenty of conversations with brands for the past couple of months. And it sounds like there's a double face to it, right? The double side. So on one hand, we talk about consumer protection and to actually empower them with knowledge about the claims that they read from brands. And on the other side, there's also an intent to educate brands, right? And to really get them to look inside and to really understand the full life cycle of their brands. So please just give us a bit of an overview of the Green Claims Code and also the intent behind it that is touching both the consumer and the business side.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. You'll have seen we launched the code, as we call it, and the guidance behind it back in September. But this is part of a long-term project and strategic aim that we have within the CMA to use our tools to really support the transition to low carbon growth. So we're really looking to encourage competitive markets in sustainable products and services. We've recently done a market study into the infrastructure behind electric car charging, and we've issued advice to businesses as well on how competition law applies when considering cooperating on sustainability initiatives. But what we're talking about today is how we are looking to use our consumer protection powers to really encourage that move to low carbon growth. We'd seen a lot of concerns from consumers, from experts, and actually from businesses themselves about increasing levels of what many perceive as greenwashing across a whole variety of sectors. We're not just talking about the fashion industry here by any means. We're talking about all real sectors of the UK economy. And a sweep that we did earlier this year within ICEPEN, this International Consumer Protection and Enforcement Network that I mentioned earlier, found that 40% of environmental claims that we looked at, and there were 23 members of ICEPEN globally who took part in this, were either unclear or unsubstantiated and therefore warranted more investigation and were therefore likely to be misleading to consumers. So this is a significant proportion of consumers raising concerns about issues that they are seeing when it comes to environmental claims. So we took the decision that we really needed to try and clarify how we think the law applies with regards to environmental claims. The piece of law that we are talking about here is the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, which we will invariably refer to throughout this conversation. I'll refer to them as the CPRs. So if I do slip into acronyms, just to flag up that one in advance. But of course, consumer protection law applies to all sectors of the economy. And whilst we were perhaps seeing more concerns in one sector than another, we've decided to issue guidance across everywhere because we did not want to give the impression that consumer protection law didn't apply as much in some sectors as in others. But I think one of the main reasons we wanted to produce the guidance, and one of the effects we want to achieve through publishing the guidance, is to really clarify the law for businesses in this space, and giving those who are genuinely investing in innovation, in ways to increase sustainability of products and services can really make those claims with confidence and gain the competitive advantage that they deserve from that investment. But what we also want to do is warn those businesses who are sort of jumping on the bandwagon and greenwashing, as we tend to call it, who aren't making that genuine investment, but rather using vague terms to try and encourage consumers to purchase their products. We really do want to take action to try and remove those claims from the market to enable consumers to see clearly those claims that are genuine and based on true innovation and investment. And that's really what we're trying to aim for here. So I appreciate a lot of businesses have been a bit startled, a bit concerned about our approach, but I do genuinely want to impress upon people that is where we're coming from. We are genuinely interested in those vague greenwashing claims, and we don't want to deter those from those businesses genuinely investing, genuinely innovating and improving things to be scared away from making claims. That's the last thing we want to achieve. So anyway, hopefully that gives a broad outline of where we're coming from. Happy to talk in more detail about other stuff as we go through the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. There's Geraint, that we were just talking about that, and also you wrote a blog for the Green Story blog very recently, really deep diving into the CMA announcement and talking about the green claims and misleading claims and how to avoid them, how to avoid greenwashing. So I think for the sake of clarity and also for everyone in the audience, can we just really talk about the difference between green claims and what they're really entitled from a legal perspective, and also what is a misleading claim?
Sure. So as Mike says, it all comes from rules that have been in place, the consumer protection rules, since 2008. So the underlying rules have been the same for the last 12, 13 years or so. What's different now is the CMA is taking an active interest in this area. It's come out with very specific guidance in this area, and it's going to be taking enforcement action in the new year. So that's the sort of difference. So it's not the underlying rules, it's this sort of guidance and focus of the regulators on this space that's changed. Misleading claims in this sort of sector fall into two categories. And apologies, Mike, you're going to come on to this in a bit more detail as well. But as you say, there are misleading claims which are just generally vague, those which are sort of, eco-friendly, environmentally friendly, green in broad terms, sustainable, even as a sort of catch-all phrase. Those sorts of phrases will be categorized as green claims. And the more vague they are, the less likely they are to be compliant, because it means that your entire business will probably have to be sustainable and have a net positive effect on the environment, is the current interpretation that the regulators, the CMA and the ASA in the UK, are putting on it. So very vague, broad claims are of concern. Obviously, untrue claims are of concern always. Claims that aren't supported. So if you say, 80% of this packaging is recyclable, that has to be true. And if it's only recyclable in very specific circumstances, you can't just put it in your home recycling bin, you've got to take it somewhere, then that's the kind of thing the CMA is also interested in. That could be misleading, even if it's strictly speaking true. To the average consumer, it's probably not true. And the other category that the CMA and ASA are interested in will be very, very specific, focused, cherry-picked claims. So something that is, again, strictly speaking true on a very narrow basis, but it very much ignores the elephant in the room, which is, most of it is made out of plastic, or it comes over on a really, diesel fuel tanker ship from China, despite the sort of positive gloss that's put on the environmental benefits of the product or the brand. So that's what we're looking at here, is a whole host of claims that fall into that category of being sustainable, organic, all these sorts of eco-friendly sort of words and languages and claims.
Could I just add to that as well, I think? Thank you, Geraint. That's very helpful summary of much of what we are interested in here. A couple of other things I think to flag up as well, where we are interested is in misleading claims by omission. So in terms of where people make a claim about something that they are doing, but they neglect to tell you something else, which we think the average consumer would really want to know about before making a transactional decision. And perhaps the easiest way of trying to illustrate what we mean here is if you think of a delivery fleet from where a business has a whole range of vehicles, and they publicise that they are making a 10% greater investment in biofuel vehicles. But what they neglect to say in that claim, or alongside that claim, is that they are making a 40% greater investment in their petrol or diesel fueled vehicles. Now, that's clearly a directly relevant piece of information that the average consumer would want to know about before choosing to transact with that business. And I think the other area where we're really encouraging businesses to think more carefully, and especially going forward as consumers become more attuned to the environmental impact of their purchasing decisions, is the sort of benefits of really understanding the full life cycle of the product, as Geraint mentioned. And that, I think, comes from the real provenance of where something comes from, how it's processed, how it's transported, how it's packaged, but also increasingly, I think, how it is disposed of, how it's recycled. And a business that understands that fully, that full life cycle of a product, is going to find it easier, I think, to make an accurate claim about a specific element of the product, and to sort of be assured that the claim they are making is about a substantial part of that product or the life cycle of the product, and not, as Geraint had mentioned, cherry picking just a small advancement in one area, when actually, when you consider the whole life cycle of the product, that's really not significant. So again, that's something else that we have tried to emphasize in the principles. There is a standalone principle about conducting a full life cycle of the product. And I should just stress there, and this has led to, I think, a bit of confusion and concern amongst businesses, that we are not saying you have to disclose the full life cycle of a product or service at the point you make a claim. But what we're saying is that you really should, it's best practice to consider the full life cycle of the product before you really start articulating environmental claims about it, because it will be seen in that context.
Fantastic, and thanks for this last for this last detail, because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is just really around the data perspective, right, and certifications. And I'm interested in getting, views from both of you from a legal perspective and also the CMA. So some of the brands would also say, how do we actually substantiate and validate our claims? So that comes into the marketing territory, right? The content that you actually use to build up knowledge around the way that you're doing things. It's around the data to actually make that content verifiable. So what are the views from the CMA perspective?
Yeah, no, we absolutely see the real benefit of there being sort of agreed metrics and standards within a sector, which can be enormously helpful, both for bringing clarity to businesses on what they can and can't do. And there's always that reassurance that where it's stated in law what you should or should not say, it's much, much easier to comply, and we appreciate that. But I think it also helps in the transparency of the conveying of that information to consumers, because there's a rigorous sort of standard or mechanism by which information should be provided to them. But I think one thing we would stress, though, is data obviously sits behind a lot of that, and it can be really useful. But sometimes it depends on how it's conveyed, and it can be very confusing. The consumer is not going to be an expert in a lot of these sectors, a lot of the technology behind some of these claims. So whilst the data can help substantiate a claim, think carefully about how that information is conveyed across to a consumer. And on your point about certification, absolutely, I think that's a really, really helpful thing. Where that exists in sectors, you can see quite clearly how our guidance fits quite neatly there. I think in sectors where there aren't those clear metrics, there aren't those clear standards, or there aren't clear certification schemes that are recognized, it's far more difficult for that data and that technical information to be translated easily and clearly through a scheme to the consumer. So absolutely, we see data as fully behind this and being really essential in helping transfer that information from the brand owner, the manufacturer, by the retailer, straight to the consumer.
And just to add to that, I think it's important, as Mike says, that the claim matches the data. Day to day, what I see across all sorts of sectors is that people have lots of impressive data, but they want to make a particular claim, but the data doesn't quite match up with the sort of claim that the marketing team want to make. And so it needs to be thought through in that way. So either the claim needs to be tweaked to fit the data, or the data, you need better data, more data, whatever it might be, you need to adjust accordingly. This, as we're on the topic, I think it touches on one of the questions that people are asking as well about these sort of third-party labels, third-party standards, which is obviously relevant in the fashion sector. It is possibly going to be a challenge for the CMA, and this is an open question, I haven't really discussed it with Mike, as to which standards it will and won't accept, which it does sort of think come up to the mark and which don't. One of the ones that I came across at completely random last week was the Global Organic Textile Standard. You might know this, Mike, I hadn't come across it before, but it talks about there being, you can make organic claims about a product if there's 70% organic constituents in that product. And 70% is not as high a threshold, I think, as the CMA seems to indicate that it would expect in the guidance. The guidance talks about almost entirely being organic products, for example. So I think there will be a process, and it won't happen overnight, where the CMA will have to sort of think about which of these standards are acceptable or not. It's difficult for those of us who are advising, I suppose, and people who want to make claims, because you won't know unless you ask the CMA or get the CMA's response which standards are acceptable or not. But I'm hoping that maybe more guidance will come, and certain standards and certain labels might be given sort of a blessing of some sort by the CMA. But we're in a slightly tricky position at the moment until those gears start to grind forward, I think.
Can I just respond on that one? Unfortunately, I don't think it's within our gift to make that approval, or things where standards sort of exist, but they're very much voluntary, unless there is a real read across to the law, what the legal requirement is, and the standard or the third-party certification really sort of mirrors the legal requirement. Then failure for a business to comply with that voluntary standard is not necessarily going to be a breach of the law. So where we're seeing there being most benefit in these third-party certifications is where it fits with an approved sort of standard or set of metrics that I think is often sponsored or approved or even enshrined in legislation by government policy. And that's why we are engaging quite extensively with other government departments, making sure that where there are policy initiatives coming up in this area, they're aware of our guidance and the importance of establishing clear metrics, which we can then refer to through the law. So unfortunately, we cannot approve those standards outright, whether or not that's something that people feel we should be able to do. In fact, a lot of respondents to our draft guidance suggested that might be something that would be useful to do. But what we are trying to do is influence government departments and trying to impress upon them the real benefits of there being these established metrics and standards within the sector from which we can see more third-party certifications being established, which have a clear link then to something that is enshrined either in law from an enforcement perspective or either from a policy perspective. So no, absolutely, that would be great to see, but unfortunately not within our gift to approve, unfortunately.
I think that's just to have a discussion on that. I think it's going to be an interesting area of challenge potentially, because obviously it's like turning a tank around sometimes, amending these claims, especially in the fashion industry where, you know, products are created and labeled many months ago. They're sitting in a warehouse ready to go, and now there's a question over whether a particular claim on the label can still be made, to take one example. Other media might be easier to sort of amend quickly, but not all. And I think brands have sort of thought, well, we've followed a global standard here. We've followed this standard for many, many years. It is, you know, 70%, 80%, or whatever it is. And there are other sort of metrics that are fed into that. So I think they've taken comfort from following those sorts of standards. So I think the message might be from the CMA, you might not be able to feel that comfortable because we are maintaining that virtually the entirety of a product has to be organic in order to make the claim organic, for example, regardless of whether you've met a threshold in a current global standard. Is that the message?
Yeah, I mean, I should say quite clearly here, where people have been genuinely trying to follow agreed standards, which are sort of the norm across the sector, we will obviously consider that when we're looking into any claims being made, and then look at, well, okay, what's the verification process behind those claims, and actually the standard itself. Is the standard itself really helping to generate that clear and genuine information about how things are produced, transported, processed, whatever the standard apply or the certification applies to, so that the consumers are assured that if something is meeting a particular standard, it is genuinely then doing what it says on the tin. That the claim being made on the product genuinely reflects what the consumer understands is the case there. So yeah, no, absolutely, we will take that on board when looking at these sort of things. And I should say we're very happy to have discussions with sectors of various sectors where there are these initiatives to produce a standard or a certification scheme. And again, I think we would really like to see the relevant government department being brought in there, and let's see if there can be something established here, because that gives that reassurance to consumers and the clarity to business, because everyone knows the standard that needs to be set, and also how the consumer protection law and other sort of regulatory law applies in that area. I think where you've got voluntary codes, which are all really good, and we're very much encouraging their use, but where it doesn't necessarily reflect an underpinning requirement in the law, then it's not so easy, I think, to say absolutely if you follow this, you're fine, you're not misleading a consumer. And that, I think, is where the tension lies. And I agree, we do have an issue here, but that's genuinely where we're trying to get to really have these open discussions with the sector and with government departments on how we can best establish metrics, certification schemes in this. Although it's not within our gift, we can at least, I think, broker that discussion and help generate the sort of thing in these areas that might be useful.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Thank you both. I'm just reading one of the questions indeed from Susanna. Will the CMA convene industry roundtables to get feedback on the use, application, and marketing of standards? So I guess that.
Whether or not that would be appropriate depends, I think, where we are in our investigation. We did say, and we've made it quite clear that during this period we are very much raising awareness of the guidance. So it's what we call our compliance campaign running up until the end of December. But from January, we really want to get going on implementing the guidance, really making sure that people are complying with it. So if we are investigating or we're looking in detail at a particular sector, we need to balance, is that the right time to be engaging about industry-wide standards where we think there are clear breaches and we are potentially going to be taking enforcement activity. But we are not averse to doing that. All I'm saying is that it won't necessarily be as easy to do depending on where we are in our enforcement process. But we're certainly open to those discussions, and we're continuing those discussions with other government departments to make sure that we're as consistent as possible, I think, in what we're doing across sectors. And one other thing to add, just because Geraint mentioned the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, and we are in very close contact with them. So just a reassurance, I think, to businesses that we are looking to apply very similar approaches to environmental claims, both from their perspective in enforcing their codes of practice and how we are looking to enforce consumer protection law, the CPRs. So we're in very, very regular contact. So please be assured that is also going on to ensure that there is as much consistency as possible in the approach we're taking.
Can I ask a question on that, which probably reflects some of these questions? Is the impression might be that come the 1st of January, the CMA's engagement is going to sort of close off, if you like, almost, because then you turn into the enforcer of the rules, purely enforcer. So when we talk about, when you mentioned brokering sort of discussions about these standards and so on, what's the mechanism for that? How do people engage with you without sort of just thinking that they're raising a red flag over their own activities? Is there a mechanism for that or not?
Well, we're very open. There is an email address that we have been using throughout the progress of the project, which we encourage people to use to notify us of issues and concerns. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that the door closes, and so from the 1st of January, we're not in listening mode anymore. That's not at all what we're saying. All I'm saying is that there may be instances where having those open round tables may be difficult in certain aspects of how we see the standards in the industry being set, if we are already undertaking some investigation or enforcement action around some elements that where those standards might touch upon. But that said, if we are not looking at a particular sector, then I think we would see what we could do in that space. And we certainly are, as I say, maintaining the discussions with various government departments where we think there's real scope for establishing some of these very useful third-party certification standards, metrics, whatever the government policy aim is in that area, but around that particular function, that would be what we would aim to do.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to start grilling you as well.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. It's a reasonable question, and absolutely. So we're certainly open, really, to people's concerns, and we will keep an eye out for initiatives going on within the sector, and we will obviously take those on board as we move into more of an enforcement phase of what we're doing. But we will still be open and listening, and I think that's something that I need to emphasize, is that when we do engage with businesses and when we start to, in terms of actually applying consumer protection law, where we think that some claims may be misleading, we will take account of the overall context. We're not experts in these sectors. We are experts in consumer protection law, but we don't know the technicalities behind a lot of these claims. So I suspect a lot of what we will be doing in those early stages will be asking for a lot of information from businesses. Well, can you substantiate this? Can you tell us a bit more about what this claim is? Because we will probably put ourselves in the shoes of the average consumer and think, well, I don't quite understand what that means. What does that claim mean? And so therefore, what we need to understand from the business is, why are you making this claim? What is it based on? And can you make it more accurate and clearer to the consumer? Because at the moment, we don't think it's conveying what perhaps you want it to convey or think it should convey. So, that I think will be very much how we will start approaching these things. We will be asking for a lot of information, I think, from businesses where we think claims are being misleading.
I think that's a key takeaway as well, isn't it? And following on from Lara's question about data, the expression of the claim as well. Sometimes it's not just that you can't quite make the claim you want to. Sometimes the claim that you're making is frankly gibberish to the average consumer. And we always have to put ourselves in the shoes of the average consumer, as does the regulator, when they look at these claims. So that is another important takeaway. I have an example. I'm not going to name and shame anybody, and certainly don't want to dob them into the CMA, but one of the claims I saw, not in this sector, was plant-based packaging, plastic bio content allocated via mass balance. I mean, I really don't know what that claim means, but it's made it through multiple layers of approvals, I imagine, and somebody's got a good claim in there somewhere, I think, or there's some credible green efforts being made. But I think that's probably an example of one where it gets to the end of the process, and I'm not sure that it means anything to the average consumer, and maybe they have to sort of touch on a QR code and go and find out more. But if the claim itself is not making sense in and of itself, then that can be a problem. And it's the kind of thing that I think people have got away with for maybe a long time, and it's the kind of thing that the CMA is going to be looking at in the new year.
Yeah, I think we'll be very interested in exactly those sort of things. I noticed, sorry, Lara, I'm just sort of, I don't mean to take over here, but I noticed there's a question in the chat around the average consumer, and it's probably worth touching on that. Geraint and I have both mentioned the average consumer quite a bit, and that's because at the heart of the legislation, for those of you who are not familiar with it, at the heart of the legislation we're talking about here, there is this concept of the average consumer. And something, even if something is misleading and really overtly it looks to be misleading, we also still have to prove that it would affect the average consumer's transactional decision. So that's why we keep referring to this concept of the average consumer. But just quickly on that, and I think Geraint will probably talk about this as well, we really think the average consumer now is going to be very different from the average consumer in, say, like 5 or 10 years' time. As consumers become more acutely aware of the environmental impact of what they purchase, they are going to become far more discerning. They're going to understand a lot more about the technologies behind these things, certainly in terms of cars and in terms of energy with hydrogen and all these other innovations and stuff. And so while now we might think the average consumer is fairly ill-informed and possibly ignorant on some of these more technical details, I think we can assume that over the coming years, they will become far more astute, far more discerning, and far more demanding, I think, of the information that they will expect to see from businesses to explain far more clearly what these claims mean. So I think that's really a driver that we're trying to encourage people to, through the guidance and through compliance awareness, is really emphasizing to people, get ahead of the game, start thinking about what that demanding, environmentally sensitive consumer of the future is going to want and expect you to deliver. Don't wait for them to demand it from you, because as Geraint has said, a lot of these things take a long time to come off the production line. So really think ahead now. What is going to be useful for that consumer? What's likely that consumer is going to want? And really start getting ahead in that space. And I think then you'll find it much easier to think about what sort of information should be provided with a claim and also behind it to substantiate it. So would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yes. And I was going to add, there's a legal test for the average consumer. So it's not something that you have to just conjure up in your mind completely. There's an element of that. But the test is that you have to imagine if it's untargeted, so if it's just a product on a shelf, then it's the average member of the public that sees it. So it's not a targeted, it's the average member of the public. And they are assumed to be reasonably well informed, observant, and circumspect. So they're the three elements: reasonably well informed, observant, and circumspect. And that means that it's not somebody who looks at your claim and runs away and doesn't understand anything and is completely stupid. That is not the test. Equally, it's not somebody who is an absolute expert on environmental claims and knows what, bio whatever content plastic is. It's the average member of the public. If you target marketing at a particular demographic, then you can look at the average member of that group. But ordinarily, you're looking at the average member of the public in that way. It's something that, all of the regulators apply the same test. Sometimes I have run-ins with the ASA because I think they really don't give consumers enough credit. And equally, I don't always buy the argument that just because you say something is sustainable or environmentally friendly or green, that you are saying that your entire business provides a net benefit. I don't think, that's not my understanding. I don't think that's many people's understanding, but that is the high bar that the regulators are sort of starting from, if you like. And so it's worth keeping that in mind.
Actually, on that point, in terms of the average consumer, and I note there's a question again there about how we defined language about what the average consumer would understand. And it's probably worth saying that we are conducting some research, some behavioural research, which will be starting fairly soon, into what consumers actually do when they are faced with environmental claims. Much of the research that we have seen around the world, actually globally, within various sectors and industry, is about consumers' stated preference or how they will behave, how they say they will behave. So like, if you had this, and this option, what would you do? And because we all like to think that we would do the most altruistic, value-driven, and make those choices, some of us perhaps a bit more honest and say what we actually would do. But what we are trying to do is actually do some behavioral research. So randomizing some products, actually giving people a shopping basket, and then saying, well, which one would you choose based on random aspects of pricing and of environmental claims, and then seeing how what they choose, and then really trying to unpick behind that what was the rationale for that, what were the reasons for making that decision. And so we really want to try and understand what the average consumer does and doesn't just think. And I think we would hope to repeat that sort of that research over a period of time to see really whether or not we're right in that the average consumer is becoming more demanding and discerning when they come across and when they're making a decision about what products to buy. But yeah, anyway, I'm doing a lot of talking, I realise, and Lara, we're not giving you any opportunity to interject any questions, so apologies for that.
No, I think this is great. These are all really valid points. So thank you both for bringing them up. I think that what is really emerging is this intention of empowering and educating consumers. So it will be interesting to see in 5 years down the road how that has changed, like in terms of what the average consumer is. Like we even spoke about it last week, and also the intent to actually get educate brands as well, to really look at the full cycle of the products and the impact that they're having. And educate also the marketing departments, because what we're hearing the most is that there's a bit of a disconnection in the way that they deliver the message from, let's say, their sustainability department. And I think that that's where the big lesson is into looking at what are we really as a business, and how do we translate that into marketing message to educate and empower their consumers, and to not mislead them into thinking something different from what we're doing. So I think that a lot of the people that sign up for the webinar, they're either in the sustainability department of a fashion brand, or the marketing and communication department. So I think that this is all very interesting content and advice that you're giving to them. So one of the questions, I'm just going through, there's so many questions, but I think one of the things that actually, Mike, you wanted to talk about was the liability for a platform or reseller or even a retailer when it comes to the CMA. Would you like to expand on that just a little bit? I know you mentioned that before.
Yeah, when we first issued our draft guidance earlier back in May, a lot of consultation responses highlighted it. A lot of people felt that the guidance suggested that the retailer was always responsible for the claim being made, and that suggested that the brand owner or the manufacturer was less liable for the claim that was ultimately made to the consumer. So in the final guidance that we issued back in September, we tried to address that, because it's clear that a retailer will be gaining the benefit from any claims made by the manufacturer and the brand owner, but there could well be liability on both parts, and we really need to look at the context of what exactly is being said by whom. So where the retailer has simply passed on a manufacturer's claim, that doesn't necessarily exonerate them, but it probably means we would focus primarily on the claim that was made by the manufacturer. But we would also expect, I think, the retailer to ensure that they have done their best, their due diligence, to really understand, well, okay, what is the evidence behind this claim? Are we just going to pass it on and not even think about it or challenge it? Seems a bit odd, If the retailer hasn't done that sort of homework and actually asked the questions, well, have you got the evidence here to substantiate the claim you're making? Because I might have the CMA or the ASA or whoever asking questions for me to justify that. So have you done that? So I think we would expect the retailer at least to have tried to get hold of that information. Now, I appreciate from a competition perspective, there may well be a reluctance on the part of the manufacturer or brand owner to disclose a lot of that technical detail to especially a large retailer. So we understand those tensions within the market, but we would expect there to be due diligence taking place in that transaction. One thing I just wanted to quickly go on to, because where we're running out of time, that's probably because I've done so much talking. But in terms of this business-to-business transaction, it's one of the questions that we asked in our recent call for inputs. I just wanted to mention as well, in the context of being able to advocate into government for certain things. I've said what is outside of our remit, for example, like approving certifications, or perhaps even defining terms that could be used in this space. We were asked by the Secretary of State for Business earlier in the summer for advice on how consumer and competition law sort of affects or possibly creates barriers to businesses in innovating to try and meet net zero and sustainability goals. So we have an opportunity here, I think, to advocate into government some of these issues that we have heard and we've seen. But one of the things we asked was, should there be better protections for business-to-business transactions? We've talked very much about business to consumer, but actually very much businesses are dependent upon the claims made by suppliers further up the chain. And so we're really interested in that dynamic and what is the reality, I think, for a lot of businesses when they are accepting these claims from further up the supply chain. And just quickly, sorry, I know I'm abusing my my microphone, I think. In some countries, we've seen them introduce legislation to really clarify this. In Germany, there's recently been introduced a supply chain law that requires, I think it's really businesses who are putting goods on the market in Germany for German consumers, they have to satisfy themselves that there has not been any sort of human rights abuses further up the supply chain, and also to ensure that the law also covers, I think, some environmental damage. So the person responsible for placing that product on the market is responsible as well for the assurance back up the supply chain that those human rights abuses and environmental damage haven't been done, and they're more or less assuring the consumer onward from that transaction that is the case. So there are options out there for legislation to come in that could be quite, prescriptive. So I think, again, we need to balance when we're giving advice into government what is possible in this space. And it may not be exactly what people want to see, but if it ultimately gives the clarity to businesses and the transparency to consumers, then that may be what is the best route in this space. We're not saying we're advocating that at all, but it is an option, I think, that needs to be considered by government. Anyway, apologies there. A bit of a monologue.
It's okay.
Let me jump in on
you.
that question, if that's okay, Laura, because one point I wanted to add is I think this is an area where the CMA is very ambitious, but I think potentially some retailers would respond to say that ambition maybe doesn't translate into reality when it comes to what's possible, because you can't imagine a platform like Amazon checking every single environmental claim that it's provided to it or that it carries on its platform, and I don't think the CMA would expect it to. So there is a happy medium. Similarly, supermarkets are not going to check every claim, not just on packaging, but on any other materials in store. And similarly, retailers in the fashion sector, I think it's not realistic to expect a retailer of multiple brands to check every green claim. And hopefully that's not the CMA's ambition either. But I think that's the message sometimes that some retailers are aware of and sort of taken aback by. But I think it's probably not as drastic as might come through the sort of guidance.
No, yeah, and just coming back on that, no, absolutely not. We see this much more as a pull and push. More of this information should be pushed through the system from the manufacturer and brand owner, and there needs to be more of a pull, I think, from retailers for that information. So, we're not trying to say that the retailer absolutely is at the end game and always going to be the one who is most liable for the claim being made. But what we want to see is this greater transparency, this greater sense of responsibility throughout that chain, from the actual production of the good right the way through to when it comes to the consumer. And I think this includes giving information about the disposability and recyclability of a product. more responsibly shared across the whole supply chain for this. There is a fundamental drive here and demand increasingly from consumers for this information. And that should be the mindset of everyone in the supply chain. This is our ultimate goal, to educate consumers and to get them, encourage them to really purchase the goods that we believe are absolutely the right ones for them to choose, because they have the biggest benefits for the environment. And that's ultimately we want to see shared responsibility throughout the system for ensuring consumers can make those informed choices.
It's worth taking us back to the legislation, because that is the right ambition for everybody. But strictly speaking, we're looking at legal responsibilities and legal obligations under existing legislation. So whilst those ambitions are the right mindset, I think we wouldn't expect to see the CMA come after people for not buying into or not sort of fully embracing, or whatever it might be, not fully carrying out, certainly not from the word go, those sorts of ambitions. And that they would focus more on, specific misleading claims or very specific breaches, obviously, of consumer protection regulations. Somebody asked the question of around the world, what's going on, what's the picture? And I'm not going to call out specific piece of legislation. Mike very correctly and helpfully brought our attention to the German legislation around supply chains. In the US, I know that different states are dealing with it differently. In California, there's been rulings on the use of recycling symbols and so on. And so they have a slightly more piecemeal, I think, approach that varies across the states in the US. But across Europe, I think the mood music is effectively the same as it is in the UK, which is all of us we're trying to get to a more sustainable ecosystem for products and more sustainable economy. And I can use those general phrases because I don't need to sort of support them with any data, and they're just lofty ambitions. And that is the disconnect. I think sometimes people want to join in with that and message the fact that they're joining in with that. But in doing so, you have to be quite specific and have support for what you are really doing and the data to back that up.
Yeah, on the international side of things, we've been in close contact actually with a lot of other jurisdictions and other consumer protection agencies who are similarly concerned. A lot have produced guidance of their own. The Dutch authority produced guidance earlier this year. The New Zealand Consumer Authority has as well. And for many years, the Federal Trade Commission in the US has had their green guides out there, which all ultimately trying to do the same thing, to help businesses to understand what their obligations are here. And even though our laws differ, obviously ours don't differ that much at the moment to those in Europe. But what we're trying to do through the International Consumer Protection and Enforcement Network, ISPEN, that I mentioned earlier, is really trying to get that conversation going and sharing our thoughts and our approaches on how all this is being approached by various consumer agencies, to ensure that wherever possible we can provide as consistent a message as possible globally to what we expect, what standards we expect when it comes to environmental claims. Because obviously there are very few businesses that don't export, that don't supply into outside of the UK. So we really want to ensure as well, there's a reassurance there that we are trying to coordinate as much as possible as we can with our international colleagues to ensure there's as much consistency and clarity as possible for business in this area.
Thank you. I'm just looking through more questions. We only have 6 minutes left, but what's the CMA's view on using icons to communicate / label that a product is environmental friendly, like a green leaf icon? Would the product need to have a net positive environmental benefit or just be comparatively better for the environment than before?
I think, again, it would depend upon the context. And if that logo was implying that it was connected to some third-party certification or some third-party assessment and clear criteria, I think as the average consumer, I'm trying to think, am I still the average consumer after everything I've learned over the last year? And possibly not. But if I saw that, I would think, well, okay, what do you mean by that? It feels like you are messaging something to me. Well, what is that? is it that this is a stamp of approval? You're claiming something here, but it equates, I think a logo equates very much, unless it's absolutely clear that that is the recognized symbol of a third-party certification scheme that the consumer is likely to recognize. Anything that's sort of vague like that is, quite frankly, I think in the same sort of camp as use of the words like eco, green. What does that mean? And what is the average consumer going to expect that to convey to them in terms of information? So I think you really need to think as a business, what would I, as a consumer, think outside your sector? Think in terms of another industry sector, and you saw similar message or similar messaging through imagery. What would you think that implied? And do think that back then to your own thing. You will know the rationale for why you've used that logo, but the consumer won't. But so try and think about yourself, you know, in the consumer shoes, in an industry where you know very, very little of the technicalities behind what's produced, think what that would mean. And so again, I think be very, very wary of using things that are opaque, vague, general. It may be that you can absolutely, you can say, my entire business is absolutely greener than green. And that's great. If you can, then absolutely sing and dance about it. But why use a thing? Why not state that across it and be very specific about what your claim is, and don't just use a vague image that conveys something to the consumer. So sorry, that may be me as a average consumer or perhaps more informed consumer, but I would really, really encourage people not to use that sort of vague imagery, just as I think the use of vague terms doesn't really convey, I don't think, what you guys would want the consumer to understand about your product, quite frankly.
Yeah, I'm going to ask this question to Geraint, just really about what Mike is explaining now, but it came in from Jane. Clothing made from recycled plastic, because this really comes down to the do's and don'ts, right? Can this be shared as a green claim without mentioning microplastics in waterways and non-recyclability at the end of life? So really looking at it from a legal perspective.
Yeah, so if your product is an item of clothing made from recycled plastic and all the plastic that's in it is recycled plastic, then I think it's legitimate to make the claim this product contains recycled plastic or is made from recycled plastic. That is either true or it's not true. If a proportion of the plastic that's in there is recycled and some of it isn't, then I think you're in trickier territory for sure. Is it implied? I often wondered this. Is it implied if you say that something is made from recycled plastic, is it implied that it's recyclable? And that is a question I imagine that the CMA might look into in its research and the ASA might look into in its research. I don't think there's a legal obligation, going back to that, to say every time you use made from recycled plastic to say that it's also recyclable or not recyclable. Would it be a good thing to do? Yes, probably. But there's no legal obligation, and certainly no legal obligation to sort of go into all of the problems that exist around plastic production and the fact that it doesn't, you can't be recycled and micro beads and so on. I mean, that's probably not relevant. That's straying beyond what's relevant. Putting all of your guilt complex onto the product is not entirely necessary. So no, I would say it's acceptable to say that if it's got recycled plastic in it and no non-recycled plastic, then you can make that claim. Mike is nodding, which is a good sign because he's the one who's.
Yeah, I think the point I was sort of really nodding about is that we're not expecting businesses to take the place of like consumer education, and I think this is where a lot of consumers are confused. They see logos and they think, oh, if it contains recycled components, just as you said, Geraint, sometimes people think that therefore that means it's recyclable, and it doesn't necessarily. We're not saying that businesses need to educate consumers on that, because clearly that's not business's role. That's government's role to ensure that. What we're trying to do here is obviously to generate the supply side, to really clarify the information coming down to consumers. Now we're going to have to work, I think, with government, and I think that's for most of us, in really trying to lobby for there to be a similar push on the demand side from consumers. How do we get consumers to become this really demanding, discerning average consumer that we think is, should arrive, and we think will arrive over the next few years. But I think there needs to be quite a bit from government as well on the consumer education side, absolutely here. And we're not expecting businesses to take that place.
Well, I would argue that actually brands, businesses and brands in this case, when we talk to in the fashion space, are also responsible for educating consumers, right? Education can come in from very different sources, as long as that an honest and truthful type of education and communication that comes from them. But I'm seeing that we're running out of time. It's 5 p.m. in Amsterdam. And I wanted to thank you, Mike and Geraint. Thanks so much for this great discussion. And really wanted to thank you for your availability, for your time, and to really deep dive into this topic. Great questions, and I'm hoping that we can just explore more in the future. So thank you so much again, and thanks for the audience, to the audience. And we'll be sharing the record soon, so it's available for everyone to re-listen, and feel free to also contact us for more information and also to get in touch with the panelists. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.